Oh, welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. This is episode 52, Novel Utility. Series of ruminations I do once a week with my partner, lover, and wife of many years, 31 next month, 2 months, Julie Rauer. Anyway, I've been doing this now. This is 52, which is the first year completed. And then as of next week, we'll be our first year anniversary. Maybe we'll have a party. Anyway, so novel utility, what is it and why is it important now? It's a specific thing that I've been talking about over the course of the last weeks. Talked about organic design thinking. We talked about the provocative artifact. We've talked about drawing as opposed to copying. Last week, we had a really great talk. Julie talked about the difference between artifice and imitation, which basically dealt on some of those issues, which we'll kind of talk about today as well. And leading up to something I think that is very important, which is a general idea about the idea of kind of like what we call the nature of the adventurous mind and the beauty of original ideas. Okay, so Julie, are you here?
Yes,
Okay, so here's what we're going to read. Read a piece from Darwin, basically, chapter 3, the struggle for existence, the one everybody knows, the one that's probably, most important to read. And right at the beginning, he talks about the different terms of selection. I'll also mention a little bit about symbiogenesis. But again, it may be asked, how is it that varieties which I have called incipient species become ultimately converted into good and distinct species, which in most cases obviously differ from each other as far more than do the varieties of the same species? How do these groups or species, which constitute what are called distinct genera, and which differ from each other that do the species the same genus, arise? All these results, as we shall more fully see in the next chapter, follow from the struggle for life. Owing to this struggle, variations, however slight, and from whatever cause proceeding, if they be in any degree profitable to the individual of a species in their infinitely complex relations to other organic beings and to their physical conditions of life, will tend to the preservation of each individual's and will generally be inherited by the offspring. The offspring also will thus have a better chance of surviving, for of the many individuals of any species which are periodically born, by a small number can survive. I have called this principle by which each selection is preserved by the term natural selection, in order to mark its relation to man's power of selection. And actually, it's more proper to kind of say not just man, but other organic species, because aside from humans, there are many social insects and other forms of life that actually do the same thing. Okay. By the expression often used by Mr. Henry Spencer of the survival of the fittest is more accurate, and it is sometimes equally convenient. And this is the piece what we kind of like came from. We have seen that man by selection can certainly produce great results and can adapt organic beings to his own uses through the accumulation of slight but useful variations given to him by the hand of nature. But natural selection, as we shall thereafter see, is a powerful, incessantly ready for action, and is an immediate and immeasurably superior to man's feeble efforts, as the works of nature are to those of art. Now, I love that last sentence. I take offense to it, right? The idea of as works of nature are superior to those of art. Okay. Now, what's interesting is in artificial selection, or the survival of the fittest, as talk about Spencer's reference, the idea is that we find ways to make other organisms better at serving us. Ants do it, bees do it, termites do. They kind of take into their own kind those which benefit them. I mean, you could almost say that's something that happens over the course of many different cases. In symbiogenesis, horizontal gene sharing, horizontal gene transfer, what an organism will do is basically take that upon themselves, in the fact that their adaptation becomes the adaptation that will basically kind of like make it within their own organism.
We're fond of roast teeth.
Yes, we are. And this usually happens again as a result of kind of hardship that kind of creates the need for opportunity. Anyway, why is this important to an architect, an artist, and a writer? It is because I find that the process, right, actually has a very strong analogous relationship to that which I believe needs to exist in a kind of in a truly organic architecture. So part of it is the fact that it is at any point a process. So anyway, that's the beginning. That's the start. We'll kind of talk about novel utility in a minute. But first, the most important part, what's new in Julie?
I will get it. You can preface it. It's right there. I didn't want to crowd up the desk. It's right here.
Oh, okay.
I took it out.
Okay. Well, Julie just finished a piece,
Yes,
and she's
I did.
about finished with her palettes, and she should be able to start painting next week on this long-awaited
I hope
piece.
so. Yeah.
Okay. So.
Okay. So this is my newest drawing that I just signed, that I just finished, signed and dated. Oh, you may want to angle. Yes, perfect. That I just finished this evening at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that I signed and dated with one of my inventive typefaces. My drawing is called Middleburg Through the Optical Lens. Little take on Through the Looking Glass. Middleburg is a storied city in the Netherlands. It still exists, and the ancient part of Middleburg is still in existence, I believe, pretty much as it was in the 17th century, where my ground plan is from. It was a fortified, canaled, concentrically organized bastion of scientific, artistic, philosophical, architectural, engineering, and botanical invention. Honestly, some of the greatest minds were birthed, and their inventions all have a legacy to this day. In fact, this was where the optical lens was invented. This was where the microscope was invented, a city that basically no one I've mentioned this to here has ever heard of, where the telescope was invented.
The home of the Dutch East India Company.
Yes. In fact, this was the home, hub, and port of the very famous Dutch East India Company. And why is that important? Because they provided an eternal and perpetual stream of exotic organic artifacts for the scientists of Middleburg to study and to base their work upon, for the many vanitas painters based in living in and working their entire careers, like Balthazar van der Ast, who was a brilliant painter, whose vanitas did not really look like other painters.
No, I didn't.
They actually had not just exotic objects, but the way they molded and sculpted space. Instead of a formal composition, most of his pieces were arranged on shelves like scientific specimens. And I conjecture, my hypothesis is that most of the artists were as much scientists as they were painters. They had huge collections. In fact, they had a curated cabinet of curiosities in their homes, in their studios. They had shells from the South Seas. They had the skeletons and fossils of animals that coming to them from the Far East. Things that no one would have known, foods and spices. I mean, it was a hub of gastronomic invention.
Right.
So I can just briefly talk about the fact that in my drawing, what you're seeing here is not just the ancient city plan of Middleburg. I've used as a substrate and anchored it upon a particular type of globe. It's not a globe that's known in this world. It's a globe of my own invention. It's a globe of novel utility. where I created a globe from a very interesting frog net and fishing vessel vase in the American wing at the Met, and made the connection spatially and certain patterns. And this is image of an orchid, L. purpurata, which is seen through a microscope using an optical lens, both invented in Middleburg. And in the seed pod, in the smallest structure of this seed pod, you will see the macroorganism, the actual orchid, an entire orchid of from whence this microscopic structure came. So the very large becomes the Lilliputian, and the very small morphs into a Goliath.
Okay. That's interesting because we talked about last week. We
Thank you.
brought up Whitehead, and
Mhm.
it's the 100th anniversary of the science in the modern world. And he talked about the century of genius, and part of what made the 17th century the genius was the fact that things like lenses were actually being invented. But I think one of the things that was important was he understood the difference between the 16th and 17th century, and in the 17th century, or history of the century of genius, Whitehead talks about the fact that the inductive method and experimentation came to replace that which was the previous rational method, which was more of a kind of metaphysical evaluation than a physical evaluation. So these things are kind of like pertinent to the same thing that we're talking about. So novel utility is that which we see, but I think also what's important to Whitehead is he talked about the fact that there was a certain genius, there was a certain ingenuity, and I think he compares also in the history of science in the modern world. He talks about the difference between Bacon, and I read you the piece from Bacon last week where he talked about the idea of the incipient circumstance of novel utility in terms of understanding that transition to this more kind of like pragmatic circumstance. But at the same time, the reality is he talked about the difference between method, between Leonardo, who comes previous, and Bacon. Bacon was a legislator. He was basically a kind of like a facilitator. He was somewhat in the kind of litigative, kind of like lawyer kind of mentality, as opposed to like a naturalistic artist, as in Leonardo. And in terms of the inductive method, he talks about the fact that there was a more kind of like rigorous understanding in that which was from the arts than there was, at least in the case from the philosophical in terms of Bacon. But why is this important? This is important because of the fact that there is a circumstance that leads to the idea of invention. And it's not just the invention in terms of gadgets, it's the invention in terms of the idea of what also White would say, the invention of the invention. And as we know, since we talk about the fact that process is the main motivator, the main mover, and it is a kind of like a process organic circumstance, we need to understand, I think, that we can use a useful analogy. One doesn't necessarily understand the value until basically it finds its utility. So the novelty of the utility comes from the experience, if that makes sense. So that's where we find ourselves in the idea that we talked about the architecturally provocative artifact. It's that something that kind of gives you a certain affection, a desire to kind of follow into it and kind of look into it and see what necessarily it could be if it has a kind of utility. And is that utility necessary? The utility is something that is. The provocative nature of it is what it could possibly have the potential to be in terms of its circumstance. So that, in a nutshell, is what we start with. So how do we get here? Right? We get here because there's a certain, I guess, inertial formality that exists in the architectural world. I think it exists in a lot of other institutional worlds too. I think part of that is what we've been talking about recently, which is the fact that the institutions have taken over and have put themselves in front of the artists. And as a result, I think certain visionary positions, like the idea um, of composer, right? Like the idea of kind of innovator, of genius, has been taken into the institution rather than left to the individuals themselves. I mean, the artists are no longer the place from which genius is culled, and which I think is a really bad idea. But because I think that's essential, I think breaking that bond was definitely was definitely a detrimental thing to do. So I think that what's happening is similar to what happened prior in the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, we saw certain places where the genius of the individuals basically kind of broke away from the institutions that had basically left them behind. And I think a similar thing is about to happen, and hopefully it comes to our benefit. So that's basically the premise. So again, given the lens of a kind of like organic reality, I feel that the idea of being able to find what something is, being able to kind of have you use your imagination to kind of find out what that utility can be and its prominence. But again, let me give an example. We have chairs, we have couches, we have tables. We live in a very conscious circumstance in terms of our architecture and our environments. And rather than kind of like question why is this formality? Why is it not being questioned? Why is it not being advanced? Why is it not being provoked? Um, we've lost sight of that as even a question that's a viable question for architects. So as a result, I think what happens is we have become obsessed with certain organizational mandates that have not allowed us to kind of go beyond that and kind of say, hey, why is it we do this? Right now, at times, what has allowed us to do things like the 17th century is that we get to a certain point where certain individuals basically kind of like come up with certain realities, like the idea of changing to an inductive method and using that to kind of like be put together with an experimental system to put some advancement on our technique. So here we are again, right? And I kind of talk to my friends in the other forums, and I talk to people who are kind of like engineering. I talk to people in mathematics. I talk to people in art and music, and I get this tremendous dissatisfaction. We're at a concert of a good friend of ours the other day, and it was an interesting circumstance. We saw the fact that there was a kind of a, I won't kind of mention the name, but the person who was I guess, the head of this very prestigious music school was somewhat tyrannical. But I think when you're obsessed with technique, right, you really need to be tyrannical because there really is you're not doing anything that's creative. You're not doing anything that's intuitive. You're basically just structuring on top of structure. And you could see that there was a tremendous amount of dissatisfaction between the performers and the people who had put together the program. One of the performers told us that he was terrified, right? Because the reality is, in this incredibly highly competitive environment where technique is the sole kind of proprietor of mobility, right? One doesn't have the luxury of a missed note or a misphrase or a misunderstanding of interpretation, which I find is really sad because I find as if what happens is we're getting to the point, like I said before, where we're allowing the institutions to take the place of the generators of genius. Mm-hmm. And they're kind of like, so in fact, Julie, one of the things we talked about this week was how that was different than when you were at Cooper. So why don't you tell us about the difference between what we saw yesterday, right, and what you remember from your time at Cooper?
Well, the tyranny of technique, and it is a tyranny, it doesn't mean that one should not be very facile, should develop their technique so they have the skill sets which enable them.
Beautiful drawing.
Oh,
just love
thank
this.
you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Which enable them to visualize and basically manifest the fruits of their imagination. I think this is really critical because we have a generation of artists and architects and engineers and scientists. We actually knew scientists who drew. In fact, the best scientists drew. There was a tradition out of Russia in particular where a lot of entomologists were
Mm.
not even considered to be players in their fields unless they were incredibly adept at hand drawing on their ventures into the Amazon. And I mean, there are many places where a camera will just get wrecked or destroyed. And the golden age of the leather bound sketchbook,
Mm.
which is not only hand drawn and hand colored, but watercolors, and I paint in watercolors, is one's natural organic extension of the natural imagination.
Mm.
I believe it is the primary tool of the adventurous naturalist. If you actually look at these books at the Golden Age.
Mhm.
So when I was going to Cooper as an undergraduate student, we were encouraged. I mean, in fact, we were told, if you're talking about something, show us, manifest it. And if you are not able to paint it, draw it, write about it, sculpt it, solder it, then you were not taken very seriously. And that is not a bad thing. That is a very, very great thing, because the idea of having standards is you don't lower standards to meet an incapacitated crowd. You raise standards to raise the bar on everyone's level of thought, everyone's level of imagination. The idea is not to sink to the lowest common denominator. The idea is to raise everyone up to a higher level of circumstance, of reasoning, of deduction, of intuition, and of practice.
Right.
And the practice extends to novel utility. We were encouraged all the time at Cooper to invent new ways to problem solve.
I think that hits the nail right on the
Mhm.
old proverbial head,
It does.
and it hurt because it was like right in my eye.
That's because it was a sharp nail.
Yeah, exactly. But it was
If
right.
it weren't
right.
sharp, it would be a
It was,
fluffy
it was,
nail.
It was right in the nail, like right in the eye.
Yeah, I had to
Yeah,
do it
I
that
could
way.
have drowned.
Eh.
Anyways, so I think that really hits the nail right on the head. The point was, rather than technique, the point was what were the ability of invention. And I mean, again, maybe I'll go back to this next week, is that Whitehead talked about the idea. It was the use of imagination in the inductive method to basically make the suppositions.
Mhm.
Not that suppositions were just kind of like,
I would flip this up
happenstance.
once more
Okay.
for there are two people that just joined us.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
Hey guys.
Hello. You this is for you, the two people who have just joined us. Since you missed our first couple minutes,
Mhm.
and we're happy that you are here now, we would like to show you my finished drawing from the Met that I finished, signed and dated earlier today. You might want to zoom in really close so they can see.
Some of the detail.
Yes, and then
we
zoom
go
over
through
to
the-
the other.
through the- Going through the town. There's the town square.
Yep.
That was like that. Yeah.
Yep.
And then out here, and then the fence. This almost makes me believe that the world was flat.
Yeah,
And
this
then-
is a different kind of world, and in the world that I imagine in my own mind, there is a novel utility of architecture and
Mhm.
engineering.
Mhm.
Anyway,
No, it's true, and I think
Yeah.
that was the point. Is I think that back in the time that Julie was at Cooper, the strength of the school was on the imagination, on the ability to interpret into information, to find that kind of like provocative artifact, to find that
Inventive
novel.
transcription.
Yeah, exactly. So
Mhm.
what made novel utility, or what made induction valuable, was not the fact that it happened mechanically or instinctively or whatever. It came about as a result of genius. And I think the reason why the 17th century was the century of genius was because not only was it not only was the inductive method valuable, it was understood in a certain way where the way in which an individual didn't litigate understanding, but basically kind of divined understanding through careful examination of the circumstance, like an artist would, like a naturalistic
Yeah.
artist, like Leonardo would do, would be to come to that supposition that was actually keen, that was sound, that was provocative. And I think that was kind of why it was important for Leonardo to be Leonardo at the time he was, to give us an insight into the way of thinking that eventually, about 100 years, because he dies, let's see, he dies in 1519. So he's in the 16th century, about a quarter of the way in,
Yeah, just
so he's not even a full quarter of the way in, but he lays the groundwork that other people can understand, that gives rise to that idea where natural philosophy, or the kind of metaphysical, the relationship between a metaphysical understanding of process and artifact, is kind of changed to be an inductive method of reasoning suppositions about what those things are, So
let me make a quick point on that.
No.
The point is intimate personal research. And this is something that people do not understand.
Exactly. That is why the architecturally provocative artifact you have to have an affection for it.
Yes.
You have to have a feeling that leads you to, there's something about this. And there's also, go ahead. I'm going to find that piece.
Say, we are suffering from
we're not suffering from it. No,
not me or Bruce.
No.
The world at this point, wink, wink, is suffering from a lack of intimate personal research, meaning people will take, people will take little snippets, little bits of things that they see on social media. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with social media, but people have lost the ability to inquire, to be curious, and to be intellectually discerning. Now, why is this important for novel utility? Why is so important is you cannot invent if you cannot intellect.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is you want to delve deeper for your own bed of knowledge upon which you will root and grow a whole plethora of really wondrous plants that have never been seen before, because you are creating them out of your own sense of novel utility.
Agreed. Here, and this is something that I think is misunderstood. Place. And maybe, maybe in 200 years, when somebody really plumbs the depth of process and reality and can truly say they understand it, maybe we can kind of further this. Hopefully I'll still be around. In scientific, this is from the Aims of Education, and this was something I've read this before. If I haven't read it on a program, I definitely should. But this was, to me, one of the really great things. At the very beginning of Aims of Education, Whitehead gives an incredibly important clue. Culture is activity of thought and receptiveness to beauty and humane feeling. Scraps of information have nothing to do with it. A merely well-informed man is the most useless bore on God's earth. What we should aim at producing is men who possess both culture and expert knowledge in some special direction. Their expert knowledge will give them the ground to start from, and their culture will lead them as deep as philosophy and as high as art. And I think that's the piece that kind of connects that piece back in the 17th century to from the natural philosopher to the philosopher and the science. Here's the piece I want to read. In scientific training, the first thing to do with an idea is to prove it. But allow me for one moment to extend the meaning of prove. I mean to prove its worth. Not an idea now an idea is not worth much unless its propositions in which it is embodied are true. Accordingly, an essential part of the proof of an idea is the proof, either by experiment or by logic, of the truth of the proposition. But it is not essential that this proof of the truth should constitute the first introduction to the idea. After all, respectable teachers is sufficient evidence to begin with. In our first contact with a set of propositions, we commence by appreciating their importance. That is what we are to do in afterlife. We do not attempt, in the strict sense, to prove or to disprove anything unless its importance makes it worthy of that honor. Now, that's not something that's kind of like relatively clear. The idea of what a lot of people would consider scientific method, right? These two processes of proof, in the narrow sense and in the appreciation, do not require a rigid separation in time. Both can be proceeded with nearly concurrently, but insofar as either process must have the priority, it should be that of appreciation by use, right? So that kind of lays the groundwork for what we're kind of talking about, is that there needs to be a consequence that's uncovered. And that basically is that idea of the novelty. The novelty gives us the sense that there may be something here that is worthy of examination. Provocation is also that which is worthy of that obligation. You have something you want to read to the crowd?
It's a little bit on the dingy side.
What's on the dingy side?
There's up one area or discipline of supreme invention, which I think really exemplifies the ideas of novel utility better than most, and that is the invention of novel musical instruments. And I will give several examples of these instruments because the idea that humans who can produce all sorts of sounds, from talking to whistling to singing, saw the necessity to push beyond their own oral limitations and invent things that took their ability to create sound, modulate sound, compose with sound, play with sound as a mode of intellectual and psychological expression. I think some of the greatest inventions ever made actually were in musical instruments. I will bring up a couple of things. The theremin, which is a brilliant idea. So for those of you unfamiliar, these are my notes from my iPad. A player does not touch a theremin. Now, a theremin, you're interrupting an EM field, and you're creating musical tones without ever laying hands on the musical instrument. That is a brilliant idea and a penultimate example of novel utility. You have an instrument that's played without being played. It is caressed without being touched. It is summoned without contact. It is a brilliant thing. And the theremin went on not just to be a musical instrument, but to be sound effects in many early science fiction films.
Yeah.
So in fact, the novel utility of the theremin was it made sounds that humans imagined existed on other worlds. Now, that is a brilliant example of novel utility. And there was some incredible invention. I will show this to you because this is an amazing thing, okay? It's called the Steinberger blend. And if you can see this on my iPad, this, believe it or not, this wild thing is an electric guitar called the Steinberger that basically not only looks like nothing else, sounds like it's basically a scientific experiment as a guitar. What the Steinberger blend was, it combined graphite and carbon fiber. So it predated the invention of graphene, one molecule thick of carbon, by decades. It basically anticipated experiments in graphene, which, as you know now, in material science, for those of you who might not know, is an enormous area of research, study, and novel utility. It can withstand all sorts of extreme heat, extreme cold. It's incredibly strong, yet incredibly sensitive. What this did was the traditional headstock, which is the recognizable part of a guitar, it replaced it and put them at the bottom of the instrument. And many people in rock and roll used these in the 1980s and the 90s. And the 1980s was a huge time. I'll just bring up one other thing, which is the Parker Fly electric guitar, which was developed by a guy named Ken Parker. It was incredibly lightweight and had a, well, wait till you hear this, carbon glass epoxy exoskeleton. Now, you don't usually hear that the body of a musical instrument is discussed in organic adjectives, in organic nouns, in organic terms. It is an exoskeleton, because if you remember when I did that paper with a scientist at the American Museum of Natural History, I co-authored a paper that we proved, which is that traditional Japanese lacquerware, with its 30 or 40 coats of lacquer, has many of the same chemical and material properties as arthropod exoskeletons. And it does. And this also is made of many of the same things. And this was a prototype.
Right. In fact, we were talking about the fact that what needs
so
to
would you like
happen
to-
in the evolution of my models is the idea of kind of like, interesting,
Here, this
is
is
the
it.
idea of incorporating more, not just more naturalistic and not more natural analogies, but the actual appearance of the use of kind of like more kind of like physical or kind of like morphologies. Well, that's beautiful. Okay.
When you have a
Yeah.
break,
Anyway, so as a result, today I actually finished a model.
Oh, yes, you have to show everyone your
what
beautiful model. This is amazing.
Yeah, this is part of the INRO series. The INRO series
Explain
where basically
what an INRO is to people
okay.
who
Well, you
don't know.
explain. You explain. Tell them what an INRO is. This is kind of like
And INRO, INRO, is a Japanese multi-tiered medicine case that is no bigger basically than this tea bottle here. In fact, it's about half this size. It stacks and it actually hangs on the obi or sash around a kimono or kasode robe, and is modulated and held in place by a bead called an ojime.
Right. So what I did was I realized that it was important to kind of make what I call live models. And I think I've always felt the value of the model along with the drawings. And I feel that there's a symbiosis. And I kind of talk about that in organic design thinking. But the reality was I felt it was important to basically make the kind of live model a kind of real thing. Architectural models are very beautiful, but unfortunately what happens is they're not constructed, they're kind of built. And I think what needs to be kind of appreciated is for the analogy, to be consequential, there's a deeper understanding when the model is actually built. And what I mean by that is I can put things together in an artificial way, or I can put things together in a way that actually has an analogy to something that actually could be a realistic process. So none of these pieces are together, which means that if I was to kind of stack these pieces, I shouldn't be able to turn it over, right? But what happens is I've made a post-tension structure. And by post-tensioning, what I'll explain, post-tensioning is when you take a cable and once you've assembled the parts, you stress it and then release it to kind of compress all the pieces in between. It's kind of like an Oreo cookie. So like if you press,
Stuff.
could be a double. Well, this is a kind of like a 1-2. This is 3 double stuffs. This is like, or 2 triple stuffs.
It's peppermint flavor.
Oh, nice. So anyway, what happens is, one of the things I felt was necessary is like there's no glue involved in this. And I thought it was important to understand that in terms of the way these things were actually built. So this was a piece that I built today, and it was a kind of a series of compressed coils put on these pieces and then basically strapped and tensioned and then compressed to kind of hold it together.
Mhm.
But part of the organic model was the necessity of understanding the organic model as a companion to the drawing, right? But
Mhm.
that was kind of something that was necessary for. Let me just pull it up
Okay,
there, and there
Jamie,
we go.
ahead.
No.
It's a really cool close-up
Yeah,
of your
okay.
elbow.
Yeah. So anyway, so the reason why so the idea is why is it valuable to us? I think it's valuable to us in the fact that at least in the kind of like industrial, mechanical, civil, architectural, engineering realities, it allows us for innovation. It allows us for an unconscious endeavor to kind of unsettle or kind of disrupt our formalities. I believe that our environment is far too conscious, far too uncontemplative, and far too rigid. I hate
It
chairs.
squashes our potential.
I think it does. I mean, I think
Mhm.
that we look at other environments and we look at other kind of circumstances in other cultures, and we
Segue.
see,
Yes.
okay,
Yeah.
we see the fact that there are places where that impulse for a kind of like more expansive formality or a kind of more leisurely or more contemplative formality or formalities has led people to different kind of conventions. We need to, I believe, move away from these kind of like conscious formalities
Mhm.
and utilities towards a more unconscious in order to kind of get at those things that could become provocatively uh, the provocative and novel kind of utilities that we could explore and discover. Yeah, we're going to say.
Very well said.
Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to bring up extremophile culinary invention. And this is very key with what we are talking about. There's no greater use of novel utility than when it is employed in a daily necessity.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think people have considered that. It's not a white tower endeavor, the invention of ways to basically innovate and change and overcome the obstacles in one's environment. This is, I think, the very heart of it. So I'd like to bring up from my own notes, which are very, very, very brief, novel utility in extreme cold weather environments. There are incredibly ingenious food preparation methods that very few people out of these localized environments know about that have been going on and persevering for centuries, especially in places like Hokkaido in Japan and Niigata in Japan, which literally are buried under 9-10 feet of ice and snow for about 3/4 of the year. And they're incredibly harsh. So I'm not sure if you are aware of just a couple of really quick, fascinating things. Snow preservation is something that people practice all the time. And I don't mean just, taking a fish or chicken and burying it. I'm saying using ice and snow to actually change the substance, taste, and texture of the food itself. A really great example is a dish called kanzuri, Kanzuri. It's a fermented Niigata chili paste, which is made by fanning out salt cured chili peppers on snow for several days. And it is delicious. Another one, and this is fascinating. This is a great example of novel utility in service of human food needs and nutrition. Is called shimi daikon. Those of you who are familiar, it's a kind of radish, but what a radish. It's dried daikon radish, which is crafted by the wholly novel methodology and ingenious process of repeatedly freezing and thawing the daikon. This sweetens the radish, transforms its texture, and makes it into an entirely novel ingredient.
Mm.
Very unrecognizable from the radish as most people know it. And this is then used in novel stews that only exist in Hokkaido and Niigata.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we've
Yeah,
already
so-
kind of
yeah.
seen that there are kind of three
Okay.
precedents
Mhm.
of this type of circumstance to
Mhm.
create novel utilities or architecturally provocative artifacts.
Okay.
I would say that a novel utility is a precedent prior to a architecturally provocative artifact. I would say that all architecturally provocative artifacts are also novel utilities, but not every novel utility will basically become an architecturally provocative artifact. So, but the point is, we have three methods, at least, that we've identified. There's natural selection, artificial selection, and symbiogenesis. The interesting thing is that Darwin contrasted in his piece between the difference between natural and artificial selection, between the breeding and the force of nature, where things happened in the maelstrom of circumstance, not simply being determined by a kind of use of an organism of another organism, or in the case of symbiogenesis, where an organism adapts by harshness or hardship to the fact that it kind of assimilates things that have consequence that give it an advantage.
Yeah.
In each case, you're looking for that advantage.
What is the starving to death?
Well,
in
yes,
an
but I'm saying
incredibly cold
again,
environment. Yeah.
in this case, right? Because
Yeah.
it's a cultural, not a kind of like natural circumstance. What gives the cultural circumstance of novel utility? It's that idea of the kind of enhanced formality. Now, formality is sitting at a table, walking in a street, laying down, standing up, dreaming, sleeping. And the idea is we have stagnated ourselves for a long period of time, as I said before, amongst these formalities, and we're not looking. We've lost the interest, or we've lost in the understanding that we have to have an interest in looking for these things. And it's like, sometimes what happens is you forget what is essential because you've stopped losing the ability, you've lost the natural ability to kind of understand what is essential. And I think in this case, in terms of the novel utility, we stopped thinking about that. And again, using the example, just the same way that the progressive pieces don't always add up in a kind of like a linear kind of fashion. Some things kind of move, and then suddenly there's a great advance. Right, the 17th century from the 16th century was a significant thing. So the reality is, it's not a kind of like it's not a straight, smooth transition. Certain couplings, certain unbreakable bonds, as they come to be, have greater or lesser significance. So in this case, that utility comes from that advancement or that provocation of formality. And what I mean by formality is a different way in which one can activate the brain, a different body position in terms of what that does, in terms of your nature of your kind of like circumstance, your vocation, your constitution. We don't think about our constitution. We basically allow it to be scripted for us. If architecture is a verb, and I certainly believe that it is, we need to determine what that script is. Architecturally provocative artifacts through organic design thinking have the potential for that to be the case. Go ahead.
I'd like to bring up architectural ingenuity and a fine example from nature of a particular bird who creates architecturally provocative artifacts on a daily basis. And that is the bowerbird, which I think harkens to novel utility, wouldn't you say?
Possibly, yeah.
Oh, I'll just say it
go
in
ahead.
a quick sentence. For those of you who don't know, the bowerbird uses whatever it finds in its not just immediate environment. It will hunt and search for not just natural objects, but if it finds human objects or refuse or buttons or pieces of fabric, it primarily will use, shells, stones, but it builds with lichen and mushrooms. It dries them out, and it doesn't just use them. The bowerbird, as they are, it shapes them, and this shapes how the bowerbird lives, how the bowerbird functions, the position of its body. The bowerbird has demonstrated by its aesthetic ingenuity, inventive engineering, a particular kind of organic architecture which is used to attract a mate. It's the males of the bowerbirds. It is aesthetically so astute. It creates realms of color, shades of color. It's a very, very sophisticated way of altering their environment.
Remember that guy, Andy Goldsworthy, the artist, who would go out into the wilderness and he did those things. Yeah, he would kind of
that
take,
would be
kind of like, I guess the bowerbird got there first. But
the bowerbird got there hundreds or thousands of years.
No, but I had an affection for his things. They always seemed kind of like interesting. You know, the fact that he would take these things where he would kind of line up all the rocks in color, and he'd create this spectrum of
what the bowerbirds do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, in his case, I think it was just to kind of create this idea of a kind of an artificial landscape within a natural environment where one could basically see the kind of attention to creating an order amongst the natural order that existed in contrast. But I found that some of them were really quite beautiful. Also, the way in which, say, you know, he would use his own body sometimes to kind of heat things and then make certain kind of things with some of the snow and the ice and stuff like that.
That's kind of what the bowerbirds do. They actually use their beaks not just to shorten things, but to carve into a mushroom. They actually dry mushrooms. They actually take the lichen and they peck away certain parts and make it into patterns.
In your piece that you did recently, you had something about the animals that decorated themselves to kind of hide in plain sight. What was that?
The decorator crab.
The decorator crab. Yeah, where they use their bodies to kind of actually take these things in this kind of like in our world, it would be kind of seen as a macabre adventure. But they took these kind of like
that's not just the decorator crab. That was the actual ghost caterpillar, which is over there, which actually takes the actual severed body parts from the spider's web and literally glues them to its own exoskeleton.
But it also shaped them.
Oh, it actually
wasn't just it's awkward kind of it built itself a suit out of these pieces
very macabre.
Very macabre. And in fact, probably to others there would be a kind of stylistic perception, and there would also be a recognition of style within the kind of character of the different ones that one could possibly see. But the craftsmanship is something that's beyond our understanding at the moment. But it's certainly something that we would be able to kind of, if we were not so incredibly ignorant about the kind of like the actual case creations of the artistic nature of other organisms, we could probably gain incredible insight. So in wrapping up, because this one went so fast. I mean, this was like, I just looked around and said like, oh my God, we're at 54 minutes already.
I tried to keep it brief.
Yeah, but I mean, we both did. But I mean, the thing is, so we probably should come up, we talked about the lexicon. And I think one of the things about the lexicon is your own crafting of the words and the terms that you use. You try to use them as properly as possible based on their etymologies, but then you kind of like see the specifics of what they are within the circumstance for your use. And I kind of always went back between, in my earlier understanding, you know, I used to look at Heidegger and Ortega in terms of their incredible precision and kind of like respect for, you know, classical etymology. But now as I kind of like see Whitehead and his kind of like more intuitive, imaginative crafting of and use of words, I feel that kind of almost like that kind of reminds me of the Maeterlinck's idea of the portrait of a lady, how elegantly and with great ease he actually creates and generates within the confines of that. So anyway, I think one of the things I want to stress is that, you know, the novel utility is that discovery of something like the mutation, like the adaptation, that thing that we see as new. And then it's the idea of, okay, now that we see it, we identify it as out there. What is it that we use to kind of find its value? So, because again, in the circumstance where you're basically attempting to survive and kind of like create the longevity of your species, um, in this case, in a cultural sense, in architecture, right? It has that value, but it also has that conditional value because, like we've said, culture is conditional, right? It's not simply about persistence. So where's the line and where is the potential? So there's a double kind of part to that. Anyway, so understand that, and then this will kind of get developed as we go further. But anyway, closing thoughts, last ideas, where do we go
Yes,
from here?
where when the very way that people live and cook and eat and read and sleep is changed by a circumstance imposed on them, you can end up with some very strange inventions.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll leave you
Mm-hmm.
with a grilled mutton dish. And Japanese people don't eat mutton.
Mutton in
And they don't
Japan?
eat, yeah. And here is it.
Really?
There was a mandate by the government of Japan a number of
Mhm.
years ago that they should all tend flocks of sheep. The sheep did not do well in northern Japan.
Yeah,
They all died.
they're not even Scottish.
No, they aren't.
I actually have a few sheep in my family tree, unfortunately.
That is very funny. Your family tree forks and goes right into
It does
the ground.
fork, but it goes right into the exactly.
Anyway, let me make this short. Is the Japanese don't eat sheep. It's not part of the diet. And if one does eat sheep, one ought eat lamb.
Mhm.
Mutton is ghastly. Mutton is the leather on your boot. It is old, tough sheep. So what did they do when the mandate happened? There was one flock of sheep left. They adopted the cultures of Mongolia and China, and there still is to this day a Hokkaido grilled mutton dish called Genghis Khan. I kid you not.
That's
And I will
funny.
leave you on that very
Okay.
funny, humorous note.
Exactly. So we come to the conclusion that we keep coming to, which is the fact that our genius, our imagination, our creativity is what projects us forward. And we do it two ways. One by simply desire for mere persistence, and the other is conditional in terms of the fact that we feel a certain desire to kind of like have a certain reality, or else we forfeit existence. So, and there are probably other ways. It's just these are the two that I identify. So like but again, I have enjoyed looking at the fact that there is a brilliance to the way in which one comes to form a speculation, to come to no, that one comes to form a proposition. One comes to make a formulation. And it can be done with equations, it can be done with numbers, it can be done with words, it can be done with symbols, but those formulations, the quality of those beautiful formulations that we see, are the ones that basically will move us forward or keep us from falling behind. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. So, as we say every week, the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to keep it just that way.
Good night.
Good night and happy anniversary. Next week will be our 1-year anniversary.
It will.
Yay.
Yay.